Good morning. On behalf of our title sponsor ThoughtWorks and our gold sponsors RenewTech, Agile Academy, Atlassian, Aconex, Dias and Intuity, thank you very much for attending Agile Australia 2010. We hope over the next 2 days you will discover more about delivering business value with Agile. What a great conference it's going to be. It's going to be a fantastic conference. We're here in Melbourne for the first time. This is the second Agile Australia conference. Last year it was in Sydney. And I can tell you not only do we have a bigger crowd this year, but a wonderful one. We've got over 450 attendees representing 140 companies from across the country. We've got people from Perth, from Queensland, from Canberra, and also from New Zealand. So thank you all and welcome. Please make the most of all the networking opportunities. We've got lots of breaks throughout the day. We've also got the open house tonight, which you're all welcome to attend if you visit the ThoughtWorks booth. And we've got the farewell drinks at the end of the conference tomorrow night. So lots of places to meet your fellow Agile travellers. My name is Rachel Slattery, and Slattery IT is delighted to be organising the conference for the second year. We're particularly indebted to our conference advisors. They're the people that have helped us with the program and sort of coming up with some of the things that we'll be doing over the next 2 days. So I want to thank them for their guidance and support. Phil Abernathy, Adam Boas, Keith Dodds, Martin Kearns, Craig Smith and Dave Thomas. The best of the conference is because of them. Thank you to all of our speakers. We have received a lot of great speaker proposals this year, and that's also for next year. Please make sure you think about maybe putting a proposal in for next year yourselves, and we really wish we could have accommodated them all. We've tried to fit as much into the conference as possible this year and tried to take on a lot of the feedback we received after last year's conference. It's still very early days for the Agile community in Australia, so any suggestions you have either during the conference or afterwards on how it may be able to serve you better in future years, please just let us know. All the information you need about speakers, for the conference, and the topics they're speaking on are in the Agile booklets. We have asked our lovely MCs who are helping us over the next couple of days to sort of try to keep the introductions to a minimum and to get stuck into the content as soon as possible. Please note that the mobile app you can download can be done so through the agileaustralia.com.au website. The link is right on top of the page, so it's a nice way to stay in touch. So here is to a great conference, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker who will be kicking off today's conference. Jim Highsmith is a co-author of the Agile Manifesto, and we're very, very happy to have him here. So thank you very much, Jim, for coming down. He's consulted with many organisations around the world and is a guru in the Agile community. News just off the press is that Jim is about to join ThoughtWorks. So well done, Jim, and congratulations to ThoughtWorks. Jim will be speaking on the topic today of Beyond Scope, Schedule and Cost, Rethinking Agile Performance Measures. Please join with me in welcoming Jim Highsmith. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be back in Melbourne. I think this is my third trip to Melbourne over the last few years, and it's great to be back. So what I want to talk about today is Agile performance measures. We're changing the world in terms of agility, but we haven't changed the world much in terms of how we measure success. And so that's one of the things that I want to talk about this morning is how do we align how we measure success with what we do? So the world is changing. We all know this. There was an article in Business Week magazine a couple of years ago titled, "There is no more normal. It's all change." And if in fact change is the name of the game from a business perspective, then it's really more important to adapt to that change than it is to follow the plan. There was a study done of 300 startup companies recently, And the biggest predictor of failure for those 300 companies was following their plan. So in fact, if in fact we want to adapt as opposed to follow the plan, and that doesn't mean that planning isn't important, we have to look at things in a different way. I love this quote. It's a little bit long. This is by a Cutter senior consultant. I recently asked a colleague, a CIO, whether he would prefer to deliver a project somewhat late and over budget, but rich with business benefits, or one that is on time and under budget, but of scant value to the business. He thought it was a tough call. And then went with the on-time scenario. Delivering on time and within budget is part of his IT department's performance metrics, chasing after the elusive business value over which he thought he had little control is not. And that's a pretty sad statement, but it's all true in a lot of organizations, this sort of real focus on time and budget rather than value. How many of you on your Agile practices or your Agile projects have had a situation like this? You've had somebody saying, be flexible, be adaptable, but conform to the plan. Okay? It's sort of this paradoxical situation where we want people to be adaptable, but we want them to be predictable also. And part of that, I think, is because we're measuring the wrong things. So I want to talk a little bit about measurement concepts. I want to talk a lot about quality, value, and then something I call the Agile Triangle, which is a different way of looking at success measures. Many of you may have seen the Standish reports from a number of years. Basically, the Standish reports say that software development is in the dumps, always has been in the dumps, anywhere from 68 to 82% challenged or failed. If that's the case, I want to know why the 3 richest people in the world are software people: Bill Gates, Larry Ellison, Paul Allen. So we must be doing something right. And I contend that the Standish Group reports, are measuring the wrong things, and that in fact, it's not that this data is a good indicator of poor software development performance, but they are a good indicator of our systemic failure of our planning and measurement processes. That in fact, we're measuring the wrong things, and that's why these failure rates look so high. So what has the Agile community done? In the project management community, we've always had this, what we've called the iron triangle of project management: scope, cost, and schedule. And that's how traditional project managers have managed projects over the years. So what did we do in the Agile community? Well, we just turned the triangle over, right? And we fixed schedule, i.e. we started to do time boxing, which was fine, and it gave us some benefit, but it still locks us into the same performance measures. And I contend that it's time to change those performance measures. That in fact, what we want to look at is value to the customer. Can we release a product to the customer? What is contained in that releasable product, number one? Number two, quality. If you go back to the iron triangle, where's quality? Well, people will say, well, it's kind of in the middle, or it's in scope. It's not there. Let me tell you, in most organizations, it's not there. And in fact, quality has to be one of the premier things we look at. And quality from 2 perspectives. Reliability, does it do what we said it was going to do today? And adaptability, does it do what we want it to do tomorrow? Can we deliver value in the future, not just in the present? Because most of our software products go on and on. I mean, how many of you working on products that have been around 10 years or 15 or even 20 years? Right? They persist for a long time. And cost, schedule, and scope are constraints. They are not goals. They're constraints. Are they important? Absolutely, they're important. You have to constrain your value delivery, or you'll just spend all your time, just delivering more features and more features. There's got to be a constraint, whether it's schedule or cost. But they are constraints. They're not the goal. And so I want to talk about this Agile Triangle from multiple different perspectives. And the first one I really want to talk about is quality. Is quality really all that important? And my contention is absolutely. If you go back to Capers-Jones, who's one of the famous metrics gurus, and ask the question about quality, He wrote a book in 1992 on applied software measurement, updated that book in 2007. A cumulative defect removal rate of 95% on a project appears to be a nodal point where all kinds of things happen that are good. Shorter schedules, lower cost, better customer satisfaction. Leading edge companies in the U.S. average about 75%. So we got a long way to go. So this is sort of a general metric from Capers-Jones. I've worked a lot with Michael Ma over the last few years. Michael is a consultant with QSM Associates. He is probably the Agile metrics guru because he's spent more time in the Agile community. And Michael and I have been friends for a long time. In the early 2000s, we would argue with each other. He would say, Agile, it's not that much better. I've seen this before. I've been doing metrics for 15, 20 years. Everything comes along and nothing changes. And I would say, Michael, you can prove anything you want to with metrics, and metrics aren't all that important. And so we would go back and forth. And then I had an opportunity with a client to have Michael come in and actually do some analysis of projects before and after Agile with this particular client. And it was a scientific instrument company up in Canada. And this was kind of the results of Michael's study of 6 projects before and 6 projects during and after Agile. And you can see some benefits. Reduction of cost, 61%, reduction in project schedule, 24%, reduction in staffing. But the number that drives all of this is the decrease in defects. This company went from 4 times the industry average in defects to a half the industry average over the course of their Agile implementation. In software development in particular, speed comes from quality. If you focus on speed, you will get poor quality and low speed. If you focus on quality, you will get high speed. It's just the name of the game, and this is one of the charts that kind of shows that. So Michael did another study, and this was a company, it's actually BMC, this has been reported in the press. 100 people, 5 locations, compared not against prior performance, but compared against industry average. So Michael has a database of some 7,300 projects across the world. You'll notice you'll notice a couple of interesting numbers here. 58% reduction in schedule from 15 months to 6.3 months. How did they do that? Well, one of the ways they'll do it, if you look at this, is they put more people on it. They doubled the staff from 40 to 92. So the industry average project had 40 people on it. Their project had 92 people on it. But notice because they did it sooner, they didn't spend any more money. But the biggest number in here is the littlest number. The biggest number in here is the 11% decrease in cumulative defects. And the reason that little number is such a big number is that in Michael's experience for the last 20-some years of doing metrics, a doubling of staff at least quadruples defects. At least quadruples defects. And here was a case, they doubled the staff and the defects went down. And in Michael's experience, that was a real touch point, a real difference. And again, they focused on automated testing, unit testing, and building higher quality. So kind of why is all this technical quality so important? What is it that poor quality can do to us? So I want to talk about 4 different things here. Number 1, the impact of code quality on testing. Most people would say on this is a 10-day development effort. Oh, I spent 10 days developing it. Let's spend 3 days testing it, right? Something like that. We'll base the testing time on the development time. Testing time is dependent on defect density. And if I have 2 development efforts, same lines of code, one with 1 defect per 1,000 lines of code, which is doable in a good Agile team, maybe even less than that, versus 15 defects per KLOC on another development effort, same number of days spent, but code with a higher number of defects. The difference is 2 days worth of testing time versus 30 days. huge difference based on defect densities. And it is very easy to get these level of defect densities on teams that don't do any unit testing, don't do any automated testing. They basically code it up and throw it over to the testing group. So the impact of code quality on testing. Number two, this was a study done by Hewlett-Packard a number of years ago, and it's pretty obvious. Difficult errors take longer to find. They found that some errors took an hour and some took 50 hours to find. You're always going to have a curve like this, but the worse the code base gets, the higher up that curve is going to move, and it's going to be harder and harder to find the hardest errors. And it's even going to be harder to find the easier areas. This is from some work that Jerry Weinberg did a number of years ago on error feedback ratio. How many of you, probably only one or two of you, have ever had the experience where you fixed something, right, and you broke something else? That ever happened to you? That's called error feedback ratio. If you've got 100 fixes and you introduce 20 new errors, that's a 20% error feedback ratio. And if you look at these charts, a little difference in error feedback ratio can make a huge difference in the time it takes to get those defects out. So all of these things sort of add up to what we in the Agile community call technical debt. And technical debt is one of those things that sneaks up on you. You know, you ignore it, you ignore it, you ignore it, it gets a little worse, it gets a little worse, and it can build up quickly in terms of design and development, and it could also build up over time. And over time, what happens is it gets a little worse, gets a little worse, gets a little worse, gets a little worse, gets a lot worse. And it sort of happens all of a sudden. And then what happens is the customer responsiveness goes down. So the customer comes in and says, I need this new feature. And you say, great, that'll take 5 months. And they say, 5 months? This little feature? And you try to explain to them about the scrambled code and the technical debt and the lack of testing, and they go, you know. And they say, can you do it in 2 months? No, it's going to take 5 months. Well, could you do it in 3 months? Well, let's see. No, I'll try to do it in 3 months. So you do it in 3 months, and what does that cause? Right? You hurry up, you put more technical debt in it, it gets worse, it gets into a vicious cycle. And the problem is, once you get into this really high cost part of the curve, all your solutions are bad ones. Right? You do nothing and it gets worse. You redo the whole system at a high cost and high expense. I mean, a high cost and a high risk. I once worked with a company in Houston. From code freeze to release of their product, their QA cycle was 18 months and getting worse. They figured out it would take $100 million to replace that system. And I told them, if you don't implement a technical debt prevention and reduction strategy with your new system, you're going to go right back to the same place in the next 5 years. And you'll be right back in the same place. So developing a technical debt prevention and reduction strategy is really important. And there is something to be said for agility. Cutter did a study a couple of years ago, last year I think it was. Our Agile developed products are easier to support and maintain. This was kind of an interesting study. 53% said it was easier, 20% said there was no difference, 5% said it was harder, and I don't understand the 22 other. It's either the same, it's harder, or it's easier. I don't understand the other 22%, but that's what people said. So that's sort of the quality side of this equation. So let me look a little bit on the value side. This has got a lot of words on it, but this was, I gave this presentation at the Agile 2009 conference in the US, and Pat Reed, who's a senior developer at the Gap in San Francisco, kind of picked up on this and actually started implementing some of this stuff at the Gap. So I've been working with her over the last year to implement some of this stuff at the Gap and see what they've been doing. But we want to create opportunities to look at value. We want to show people that value is important to us as it's important to the business. And we want to do the highest value things early. So all of these kinds of things can increasing throughput, decreasing operating expense, decreasing investment, and there's a whole list of these things here. But these are all ways in which we could go about in creating value opportunities. One of the ways we create a big value opportunity is to do less. One of the things that we've seen is that scope is a terrible measure of progress. These are 3 studies that have been done, most of them in the early part of the decade. Again, a Standish study of a number of different companies in the industry, that 64% of the functionality in that software was rarely or never used. A DoD study of $35 billion worth of software. That's a lot of money, but to the DoD, that's kind of peanuts. 2% of the code was used as written. An IEEE study of commercial software, 400 projects over 15 years, less than 5% of the code was used. So what do? We build these huge requirements documents, and we turn them over to somebody and say, implement them, and we don't systematically review each of the functions and features to see if it's really valuable or not, and we end up producing software, bloatware, that has all this functionality, all this code that nobody uses. What if we could reduce that by 10% or 15% or 20% by being very precise about how we look at value and how we negotiate every iteration, every release, as opposed to sending out a big requirements document and just building the whole thing. In a traditional software development, the cost-value curves go something like this. I'll just say the cost is linear. And the value curve, the value captured, goes up very slowly because in a waterfall serial project, most of the value comes towards the end. So we end up at the end, hopefully, with 100% of the value and 100% of the cost. But we don't get that value until very late. And an Agile project has a different curve. The cost is still linear, more or less, but what happens is we start producing value earlier on, and sometimes we can actually deploy it. At some point, we can actually deploy that value and actually capture the business benefit early. And so the curve goes above the cost curve fairly early and then stays there until the end. But that's not even the most important point. The more important point is, where's the right cutoff point? If you go to your chief financial officer or your CEO and you say, by the way, on this large systems project, we can deliver you 100% of the value for 100% of the cost, or we can deliver 90% of the value for 70% of the cost, which one is your CFO going to take? He's going to take, or she's going to take, the 90% for 70%. But it even goes beyond the project at hand. Because while you are working on project number 1 and the lower value features on project number 1, if you stop that and you say, this is enough, this is implementable, I can release this to the customer and they will gain value out of this, it allows you to go on to the next project, which has higher value features than the features in the current project that you're working on. And so it also impacts portfolio management in how you do the next project earlier. So you want to do the most valuable stuff first and evolve those features and determine the right cutoff points. And that's a business decision. And so what you want to do is you want to look at the capabilities, features, and stories and constantly look at reducing that marginal functionality. Can I cut a little bit of functionality off this story? Can I cut this story out? Can I shave a little functionality off of this story? So I have stories that may be a simple story to implement that feature or a little bit more expansive. And I need to base, and these are cost numbers on features. What if I could have the feature value, in other words, have a value, not at some great big ROI on the project basis, but all the way down to the feature to say this particular feature is worth 10 feature points, 10 value points. And that's the next step. And this is a chart, again, that Pat Reed did, sort of summarize some of the things that I was talking about. We've been so focused on the cost size. And on the cost side, maybe we do something like story points at the bottom And what the Gap does, since they're in the garment business, even at a portfolio level, they use T-shirt sizing, small, medium, and large, extra large. That's the way they size projects. And they have a range for each of those. Because it's not particularly effective, right, to spend hours and hours and days estimating these projects in a portfolio that you might not get to for a long time, just like in a project. But we also want to do the same thing on the value side. But it's a little bit different in that we can calculate cost from the bottom up. We can say this story seems like it's going to take 4 or 5 story points to do. What you have to do with value to keep it simple and effective is allocate from the top down. You have to say this particular project is worth so many value points, and then allocate those value to features using your product management people, your product owner, to help in that process. So this is really the allocation. And just like story points are relative cost, value points can be either absolute financial or relative value. Because what do I want to do with value points? I want to do 2 things. I want to show to the business that we think value is important. And I want to help make priority decisions about this particular feature versus this particular feature. Or I've got a feature over here that's worth 25 value points, and even though value points and story points are not the same denomination, but I've got this one that's worth 25 and it's 2 story points. Hey, that's probably a pretty good investment. I've got this feature over here, or this story over here, that's got 1 value point and 50 story points. That's probably out of whack. Is there any way I can cut this down? Can I cut down the cost of this thing or eliminate it completely? So it gives us another way of making priority decisions. So one of the things that I like to say to product managers, product owners, from a development perspective, is if you don't have time to estimate value, we don't have time to estimate cost. Okay? You know? And if they say, well, it's worth about 50, and I say, it'll take about 25. You know, so you do the same level of estimating on value, on cost that you do on value. Now, I was at a conference in Ireland 6 or 7 years ago, and a guy from Intel was speaking, and he had the greatest concept that I've seen in a while. He actually had, within Intel, they had a concept of a business value maturity model. We've all heard of the CMM and the CMMI, which is a process maturity model. And one of the problems I've always had with process maturity models is they didn't look at the output. They didn't look at the result. All they looked at was the process. Now, if you have a value model and a process model, now you've got the whole thing. And so I looked at this Intel stuff, and the other thing that Intel had, and I don't bother to try to read all these things, it's pretty small type, but they had a whole list of things that Intel used in the calculation of value within Intel. And then Pat Reed at the Gap took those and really came up with their own set of value dials in the Gap. So this is part of and parcel of the way they end up calculating value at the project level and then allocating it down. And you could, like I said, if your business does net present value or ROI calculations on projects, then you can actually allocate dollars down. If you don't, and we all know those numbers are funny numbers anyway, you can just do relative value. This is a chart. This was actually developed, this is called a parking lot diagram. It was actually developed by Jeff DeLuca, who is a Australian project manager who actually lives in Melbourne. I don't know, Jeff, are you by any chance here? I see a hand. Anyway, he developed this several years ago in conjunction with what's called feature-driven development, Agile methodology. And one of the things that I love about this diagram is it shows you what's valuable and what's been done that's valuable. If you think about a Gantt chart, what a Gantt chart shows is tasks and schedule. It's schedule-oriented and then task-oriented. Time or schedule in this one is in a little box at the bottom, but each of the big boxes is a capability, each of the smaller boxes is a feature, and then the numbers within that feature say how many stories went into making that up. And it only goes green when it's deployable, when it's what we call done, right? Development is done with it, and the customer says it's done. So what you've got here is you've got a look into the value of this particular project. So I could actually implement or deploy, possibly, established product catalog, established network arrangement. So it's a very different way of looking at progress on a project than a traditional Gantt chart. And it also gives you a lot more information than just a velocity plot. Velocity tends to be way overused in a lot of organizations. You take what is a reasonable measure for teams to use with themselves and you elevate it too high. But that's another story. What I'd also like to say is that you have to be careful that value and priority are different. Value is one of the things that goes into prioritization, but it's not the only thing. So risk mitigation, in some situations, in some iterations, it may be more important to mitigate risk than it is to produce the highest valued feature. You may have some dependencies. And so value is probably the most important of the priority items, but it's not necessarily the most important. The other thing that happens, remember earlier I talked about technical debt and technical debt reduction. Sometimes it's very difficult to get a handle on the value of an increment of technical debt reduction. And so you may want to prioritize those technical debt reduction stories differently than you prioritize customer-oriented function or stories. So again, a traditional project manager sort of focuses on following the plan with minimal changes, whereas an Agile leader really focuses on adapting successfully to inevitable changes. And part of that adaptation means you've got to be measured on the right things, that in fact you want to be measured on value. So for example, is this product releasable? Not have I finished all the detailed requirements, but is the product releasable? Every iteration, what's keeping me from releasing this product today? I have a friend of mine who's a CIO with a company up in Canada, and they had a project they were doing for their marketing department. And their marketing department said, we have a list of 100 features. And the guy says, fine, we're going to implement all 100 features. What are your top 3? And they said, no, we got 100. Got to do all 100. He said, fine, this is cool, we'll do all 100, we'll get to them. What's the top 3? And so they said, okay, these are the top 3. So they implemented those top 3. So he went back to him. He said, okay, what's the next 3? And of course they said, oh, no, we got 96 more, They said, fine, we're going to do the 96. What are the next top 3? And this went on for a while, and they got to 20. And they went back to the client and they said, okay, what's the next top 3? And they said, that's all, we don't need any more. And he said, well, what about the other 80? He said, well, those were just kind of nice to have, but man, we've got these top 20. They're really helping us out. They're really producing some business value and some benefit, and that's enough. And what this guy was saying is, on a traditional way of doing a big requirements document that had all 100 features in it, and then dropping it on an implementation staff and getting all of those features done, it's just like putting money on the floor and burning it up, right? So we want to focus not on scope, not on requirements, but on releasability. Does it meet the product vision? Does it meet the project objectives? Does it meet the business objectives? Are the capabilities and features generally enough to make this a product that the customer is going to get benefit out of it? And, and does it meet our kind of time box and schedule? And so looking at success, not from the standpoint of scope, but of, first of all, value. Do we have a releasable product that's going to deliver value to the customer? And secondly, as I said, delivering high quality today so that we can deliver high quality tomorrow, so that we can deliver value tomorrow. If, in fact, we cut corners on quality, we cut corners on our ability to deliver value tomorrow. And that's a balancing act that we're not doing so far a very good job at, except in some organizations. I worked with a company about 6 or 8 years ago, and they were developing a product, and they got out version 1, and it's a brand new product in the marketplace. And they incurred a little bit of technical debt because they had to get it out on a certain deadline. And so they went back and they spent about 6 weeks cleaning up the technical debt, doing a little bit more testing. And I asked the development director, I said, would you have ever done that before Agile? He said, no, we would have just gone ahead with new features and functionality. They were working on the next release. And marketing came in and said, boy, do we have an opportunity for you. We had a whole new market in Japan, and so we need a Japanese version of the product. So the team went up, took all the cards off the board, talked to the product manager, put the new cards up on the board, delivered a Japanese version in 42 days. I know teams that would have argued for 42 days. These people, they don't know what they want, they're always changing their minds, yada, yada, yada. So why were they able to be responsive to the business? And I contend that there are 4 reasons they could be responsive. Number 1 is they had a product that was high quality and adaptable. That in fact, if you're the best Agile team in the world and you're stuck with an old spaghetti code application, you're not going to be very responsive to the business. Number 2, they had Agile people. They had people who were willing to adapt. Number 3, they were using an Agile process, so they had agility built into the process. And number 4 is they had a company architect, Kevin Tate, who built some stuff into the architecture, who actually did some thinking about it ahead of time, which is sort of an anathema in many Agile circles, but he built a few hooks into there that because he knew that some changes were coming and that we'd probably have to do a foreign language version. So focus on a releasable product that has value to the customer, focus on quality that's both reliable and adaptable, and constraints. And again, whether the major constraint is scope or actually schedule or cost, they're still very important. They help you make critical design decisions. They help you make critical planning decisions. So it's not that those constraints are unimportant, it's just that they are not the goal. I was working with another company not too long ago, and they were doing a huge project for a pharmaceutical company. And the pharmaceutical people were coming to them and they were saying, yeah, you know, we're complaining a little bit about the schedule and complaining a little bit about the cost. And I said, when you go in to talk to them, I said, don't show them this Agile triangle. I said, but just talk to them about the features that you've already built. And talk about, you know, what you've done, and you've done this feature, you've done this capability, and so tell them what you've already done that's in production, or actually in the instrument that you could demonstrate. I said, and then talk about, because the company had already had 2 failures on this project, and those 2 failures had been around quality. And I said, then talk to them about quality, and talk to them about what you're doing and how you're doing the testing, and the fact that you've already put a partial application into the lab, and some of the client's people have already checked it out. I said, and after you've talked about value and quality, then go to talk about schedule and cost. And he said by the time they got to the schedule and cost discussion, it was a non-discussion. That they were pretty pleased. So the strategic questions ought to be around, why couldn't we release this product today? Okay. What's keeping us from releasing this product today or deploying this product today? What is our value-cost ratio for this particular product right now? Have we got 70% of the value captured? Have we got 80% of the value captured? And how much is the cost of that? And is it enough? And that's a business decision, right? That's not a technical decision. That's probably not a product owner decision. In fact, you probably don't want the product owners and product managers making that decision. You want the business owners making that decision. Is the product of high quality? And are we within acceptable constraints? Right? The constraints thing is last. So it's the different kinds of questions we ask about projects. And this is a big change for people. I mean, I've talked about this a lot over the last couple of years, and people say, okay, sounds pretty good. But implementing it is not necessarily easy because you're going up against a lot of corporate history in most organizations that are really based around other factors. But as Einstein said, no problem can be resolved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Thank you very much.
Bobby.
be happy to take a few questions.
Just one moment, we're going to have microphones coming down.
Oh, okay.
And if you can just identify yourself before we take your question.
Dominic Godwin from Dynamic Hearing. You brought up an issue about, you gave 4 examples of why a particular product was extensible, and the last one you said the architecture had been made extensible.
Mm-hmm.
And you also gave the example of you took the top 3 features, then the next 3 features, and you only got to 20. The problem is, what if some of those other features on that list of 100 required some architectural design decisions to have been made early? Otherwise, they would never have. You couldn't implement them. Sometimes you can lock yourself into a corner by only taking the top 3 features and ignoring some features that you may need later.
Okay, so one of the things in the Agile community that we have to learn to deal with is what I talked about earlier this morning in terms of paradox. We have to be able to balance things that we would like to have a either-or decision about. So you either do front-end architecture or you don't. That's the way we'd like for it to be. And the answer is no, it's both and. We have to do some early architecture work, but we also have to do evolutionary architecture. We have to do some early requirements work, but we also have to do some requirements work as we go along. And that balancing act is at the core of what Agile teams really need to work on. It's not one or the other. In fact, Scott Ambler has done a lot of surveys over the years. I don't know if you've heard Scott speak, but one of the things he talks about is that there are a lot of myths in the Agile community about, Agile people don't, in fact, believe you ought to do any early architecture. And what you find is 70 or 80% of the companies that actually do Agile do some. Okay? But it's that balancing act. We don't want people to get into months and months of early architecture work and then have to throw it all away. And in fact, I've had experience with people who wanted to do all that early architecture work, and then we got into some architectural trouble 3 or 4, 5, 6 iterations into the project. And interesting, the architect in this particular situation came back to me and he said, I could have worked on this thing for months in the beginning and I still wouldn't have found this problem. I found this problem through iteratively developing it. So, unfortunately, that balancing act is one of the things that we have to do.
Hi, thanks, Jim. Alan Earth here from Ivar Jacobson International. Jim, I was wondering if you agree, some of the problems you talked about this morning, there's a kind of disconnect, I think, in that IT teams have little or no understanding of what business value they're delivering. And on the flip side of the coin, we have business people who have no connection with how much money they're spending on the value that's supposed to be delivered. And a lot of the stuff you talked about this morning was kind of, as IT professionals, us trying to improve that. But I just wondered if you have any opinion of how we can kind of close that gap a bit.
Well, I think the Agile community in general is trying to close that gap, number one, by delivering more reliably and gaining the trust of the business. I think business, particularly as younger and younger people are moving up into roles in business, are more and more technology savvy. So I think both of those things are happening, and I think it behooves us to work on that as much as it behooves the business managers to work on that. In fact, my sort of focal point for the last couple of years has been really on above the delivery team level, at managers and executives, and trying to get IT people more hooked into the business strategy and vice versa. And it's interesting, if you kind of look at my work over the last 10 years, it kind of mirrors the acceptance of Agile into different organizations. I've worked more with software companies than IT organizations and more with IT than government. Right? And because as you move into a software company, there is really a more direct link between development and money coming in the door. Whereas in IT, you typically have, the intermediary of all the other organizations within the business. And so it's hard to it's easy to sort of forget that you're trying to deliver customer value. And I think more of that we can imbue, in the teams, the better off we'll be.
Hi there, John Coleman from Suncorp. Just following on from that last question, I'd really love to be able to use some of the pages or some of the information in this slide to present to some of our business sponsors on the project I'm working on. What material, is there any material that's more focused at the business? I noticed this particular one is kind of focused on the IT as the previous question was asked. Is there any that is kind of more shaped towards the business, or can we use it, reuse it and shape
Well,
it
I
ourselves?
think you take it and you reshape it. I mean, this was tailored to this audience, which is a lot of IT and software people. But I have some other presentations that are really more focused on the business. But a lot of what I do work with is IT managers and trying to get them to look at how agility can help them help the business with the business strategies. And help to make that link of why agility. I talk about agility at 3 levels: at an operational level, a portfolio level, and a strategic level in an organization. And you've got to understand how the business strategy, in terms of its responsiveness in the world, can link down to agility. And therefore, you've got to pick which level you want to shoot for. I mean, operational agility, just keeping agility at the development team level, that's fine in some organizations, but it doesn't take full advantage. But those are 3 distinct levels, and you've got to really build a case for each of those levels.
Yeah, g'day. Mark Andrew from Lonely Planet. One of the things that puzzles us, I guess, is you have to get permission for funding for Agile projects.
Yep.
And I love the value points, but you have to, at some early point, make some sort of prediction of what value you're going to deliver for the money they're going to give you.
Sure.
And I'd wondered whether you'd given any thought or around how you actually put a business case together that's based around delivering Agile value.
Well, I think a lot of the business case stuff is still pretty traditional. Net present value, ROI, those kinds of things. And unfortunately, in most of our businesses, our financing decisions are made on long-term stuff. You can get $100 million for a project, but you can't get $25 million each year for 4 years. They want it all kind of up front. And so one of the things over time is that we're going to have to look at those funding models to see if we can change them. And then until then, we're going to have to just work within those current funding models and do the best job we can. But I think one of the things is if you start coming up with projects and you estimate them at $5 million and you keep coming in at $3 or $4 million or $2 million, maybe the CFO will begin to ask the question, well, that looks pretty interesting. Why are you doing that? I've been working with Pat Reed at the Gap. Something that most development staff people don't really worry about and don't really know is really important to CFOs, and that's, at least on the U.S. with our tax structure, is capitalization. How much of your expenses can you capitalize versus expense? And Pat's figured out a way to capitalize 90% of the development expenses in their company, which makes her very popular with CFOs. So I think one of the things that we're going to need to do as an industry is begin to think about people like CFOs, like chief engineering officers, like other C-level people within the organization or high VPs within the organization, and figure out what about agility appeals to them and how we're going to help them do a better job. And there's some people who are just starting to look at those kinds of things. One more.
Simon Wilde from Telstra. I guess that last question I very much sympathise with, and I wondered if you had some good case studies of organisations that had managed to put in appropriate governance models and funding models.
No. I'm sure there's some out there, and like I said earlier, I've done a whole lot of work with software companies, and I've done some governance models. First of all, we'd have to talk about what do we mean by governance, because it's an overused word. And I have done some governance particularly phase gate governance models, and applying them to Agile development. Those have kind of been done on a case-by-case basis, and I haven't really heard too many people speaking about those kinds of things.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Please join with me in thanking Jim Highsmith. That was a wonderful start to the conference.